All right, so in today's lesson, we're going to talk about line graphs. Okay, we're going to talk about line graphs and what they are and why they're important in statistical analysis. Okay. Um, so basically, a line graph is a type of statistical graph that is used to show changes between intervals of time, right? Usually, okay. Line graphs fall under data analytics, whereas when you're analyzing data in order for you to make conclusions about the data that you're finding. Okay, a line graph looks something like this. Right, looks something like this. But you have an x-axis, you have a y-axis, and the graph may look something like, you may have these little arrow marks. Right, and the graph itself may look something like this. It may look like a straight line, like this. It could look something like this, but usually it looks something, in the real world, it looks something like, it goes up and down, right? So it may fluctuate. It may go like this, this, this. It may dip. It may flat, like something like this, right? And depending on what it is that you're studying, usually it's through time, usually, and whatever it is that whatever the y is, right, that you're measuring. Let's just say, like, for example, like if it was YouTube, for example, right, it would be like the number of views, right? What you will learn once you get into both in statistics and in Algebra 1 is that you learn something called a dependent and independent variable, right? In this case, the independent variable is time, and the dependent variable is the number of views. But we're not gonna go too deep into that, right? We do have to know it, but we don't have to go like real deep into it right now. All right, so a line graph looks something like this, right? A line graph looks something like this, realistically, right? There are line graphs where the line just goes up, up, up. That's true, and the line just goes down, down, down. But for the most part, in the real world, depending on what it is that you're measuring, that it may fluctuate. It doesn't stay the same, right? Okay, so why are line graphs important, right? Line graphs show the fluctuation in changes. It shows the change between things, per unit of time, right? And so, if you want to analyze data, we have to be able to, determine, like, at what point, depending on how the graph is drawn, at what point, does something happen or which something changes, right? So, for example, let's say this was the number of, let's say, for example, this was like a real graph, right? And we said something like, right, this is the number of views on YouTube, right? And let's say this was, one day, let's say 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, 96 hours, so on and so forth, right? What's 96 plus 12? 108 hours. 120 hours. 132 hours. 146 hours. 1 hours. So on and so forth, right? Basically, what it's saying is 0 hours, right? We can make conclusions about the line graph based on the data provided, right? So we can say, like, if this was the line graph and this was the number of views on YouTube, right? And let's say, for example, you started out you know, you started out with zero hours when you first published your video, right? And then you said something like, okay, in 48 hours, you know, you got 400 views, right? Then the question may ask something like, okay, so in 48 hours, how many views did your video get at 48 hours? And you would say, well, at 48 hours, it got 400 views, right? And then we could say, okay, so then we could say, okay, well, for the first 2 days that the video was very popular, it rose, right? The number of views rose, but then some period between 48 hours and 108 hours, it stopped, right? There was no change in the graph. And then between 108 and 146 hours, that it went up again, right? And then it went down, and then it flattened. So what can we determine from the graph? We could say, okay, well, the first 2 days there was a spike, you know, there was a spike in views, right? That means that, you know, the views were very popular for the first 2 days, right? And then we could say, well, between day 3, more or less, between day 3 and day 7, right? What happened? Well, there was no change. What happened? There, you know, there was no change in views. There were no change in views between, you know, between day 3 and day 7. Okay, and then what happened after that? Okay, well, you know, then it went up again. You can see that it went up again from this interval to this interval, right? It went up again, right? So this is when the views were increasing, and this is when the views were increasing, and then it went down. It went down. This is when the views were decreasing, and then this is when the views were flat. You know, there was no change. There was no change, right? Why is this important to know, right? Why, you know, besides just answering the question, right? Depending on what the question asks, and they said something like, you know, if the question says something like, you know, in which time period, you know, were there no change? And you would say, well, between 48 hours and what, about 108 hours. There were no change. There was also no change between, you know, at the end, right? At the end right here, there was no change, right? Okay. Why is this important? Why is this important to understand? You know, why in data analytics is this important to understand? Okay, maybe, you know, they need to understand this because maybe it may be something where they say, well, maybe on a particular day, right, that depending on when you post the video, maybe there's a spike in views, right? We can, you know, or maybe, you know, maybe the video is not as popular on certain days because it's just some, you know, random variable, right? These things are important to know in data analytics because it gives us an idea of what conclusion can we make from the data, and based on that conclusion, what can we do to improve what we're already doing, right? So maybe, and for example, like in this example, that maybe if we're looking at the number of views on YouTube, for example, that maybe there's some videos are just more popular on certain days than others, maybe, right? So we can say, okay, well, if we're looking at this from a researcher perspective, then we can say, okay, well, then we could just post our videos, right? We can post our videos on certain particular days so that we can maximize the amount of views that we have on YouTube, right? Through YouTube analytics, right? Now, in reality, when you use YouTube and you use YouTube analytics, they actually tell you the number of views, right? But they do give you a line graph that tells you like how much things have changed over time over a 48-hour period. So that is true, right? But we have to be able to like read it so that we understand what we're doing, right? Okay, let's do another example, right? Let's say we did the same thing, but let's say this time it wasn't like views on YouTube, right? Let's say it wasn't views on YouTube. Let's say it was your, how much you get paid, right? And let's say it was how much time you were getting paid. So let's say you have, let's say it was 30, let's say 30, 16, 90, 120, 150, 180, 210, 240, right? And then let's say, right, this is per hour, right? And let's say we try to graph this, right? So we said something like, okay, well, this is at 0 hours, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, right? 1 is 30, 2 is, 60, 3 is 90. Yeah, these are ruler here, but I don't have one right now. Okay. 4 is 120. 5 is 150, right? And I said we do it, right? I said we graphed it, right? This is another example of a line graph, but this is more of a line graph. You'll learn this in algebra, that this is called this is a line graph. This is a line graph, but notice how it increases, right? It's called an increasing line graph, but this is an example of an increasing line graph. You learn this more in Algebra 1 when you take it, okay? So, in this graph, we see that the graph is constantly increasing, right? Every hour, right? And this is, what we're measuring is the time per hour, right? And we're measuring, your pay rate, right? And so, let's say this is 0, this is 0, 0, this is 130, 260, 390, 4, 120, and this is 5, 150, right? So we want to know, right? So that's based on the data, right? What can we determine from the data? We can determine from the data that, okay, we know that every hour that is increasing by 30, right? We know that every hour is increasing by 30. So since it's increasing by 30, we know that our pay rate, we could just determine that our pay rate, how much is our pay rate? How much are we getting paid? How much is our pay rate? The pay rate is $30, 30 USD per hour. We know this to be true because we could just look at it. 0, 0, 130, 260, 3, 390, 4, 120, 5, 150. We know this to be true because we can see it on the graph, right? We can see this on the graph, right? We see that it's increasing at a constant rate. You see what I'm saying? So we know that it's $30 an hour, and then we can ask additional questions, right? We can ask and say, well, how much did I get paid at the 4th hour? How much did I get paid? How much did I get paid at the 4th hour of work? Okay, I got paid $120 at the 4th hour of work. How do we know this? Well, if I get paid $30 per hour, okay, what's 30 times 4? 30 times 4 is 120, right? So I know I got paid this. You know what I'm saying? So that's that. We can ask additional questions. So we said, well, if $30 an hour is we getting paid per hour, so then how much do we get paid we can look into the future and say, well, how much do we get paid at the 8th hour? Okay, well, the 8th hour is 30 times 8. So what's 30 times 8? 30 times 8 is $240, right? So we know that if I work for an 8-hour day, I'm gonna get paid $240, right? There are many different types of graphs in terms of line graphs. They actually have a thing also called a double line graph, right? And a double line. These are examples of single line graphs, right? This is an example of a line graph. This is also an example of a line graph, but this line graph is called an increasing line graph. You will learn in a more advanced course that you have increasing and decreasing, and you have constant, right? But for the purposes of this video, we're just going to talk about this very simple line graphs, right? So this line graph is called single line graphs because it only shows one line, right? They also have in statistics, they also have double line graphs, and a double line graph would be like if there's two lines showing, right? And the two lines will show that it's showing, you know, because we're trying to compare between the two. So for example, let's say for example, we looked at views, right? And then let's say for example, it looks something like this, right? Right? This would be an example of a double line graph because we have two lines in the graph, right? And thus the two lines we can then with this additional information we can make comparisons between the first line and the second line, right? The purpose of this video, we just want to talk about line graphs, the single line graphs, okay? There are double line graphs, but we're not going to talk about it right now. So that's it for today. Basically, let's recap. Line graph is a type of statistical data. It's a type of chart that shows information in the form of statistics. We can use line graphs to make informed decisions, right? We can use line graphs to answer questions, right? And we can also use line graphs to look into the future as an example of an increasing line graph, right? Assuming that the rate is constant. Okay, so that's it. That's it for today, and I hope to make another video soon. Thank you. Bye bye.